In the beginning, there were no kings, no legends carved in stone, no tales sung around fires. There were numbers. Long before myth and poetry, humanity organized itself through In Mesopotamia, home of the world's first cities, life wasn't built on heroics. It was built on clay tablets and cold accounting. The Sumerians invented writing not to tell stories, but to track barley and goats. The temple ledger. The temple was the center of life in ancient Uruk, not just religiously, but economically. Priests weren't spiritual mystics. They were bureaucrats. They managed land, labor, and livestock. Inside one temple, archaeologists found thousands of tablets that say very little. 3 sheep, 1 worker, 5 baskets of grain. And yet, these mundane lines map the entire structure of ancient civilization. Scribes didn't dream, they counted. And in counting, they created order. Becoming a scribe, to be a Mesopotamian scribe, was no glamorous role. Training involved memorizing hundreds of wedge-shaped cuneiform signs, each etched by stylists into wet clay. Students practiced by copying dull phrases. The house is good. The man has oxen. 3 goats went south. Over and over. Precision was everything. Creativity was forbidden. The scribes wielded power. They documented taxes, settled disputes, approved trade deals. If a number was off, a life might change. This is boring history at its finest. No battles, no drama, just quiet control through correct arithmetic. The rise of audit culture. One of the oldest surviving tablets is a ledger noting sheep distributed from a temple storehouse. It breaks down by day, purpose, and recipient, because Mesopotamians feared corruption more than invasion. Auditors, yes, in 2300 BC. He reviewed temple ledgers to catch theft, misallocation. A corrupt priest could face fines or exile. These quiet enforcers maintained trust in a world built on grain. Boring, but revolutionary. What's fascinating is how this boring system spread. Sumerian accounting formed the backbone of later civilizations: Akkadian, Babylonian, Assyrian. Scribes copied templates that hadn't changed in centuries. History advanced not through innovation, but through repetition. Each day, somewhere in Mesopotamia, a scribe sat hunched over wet clay, noting that 5 goats entered the stable and 2 left. That math kept an empire upright. When we think of Egypt, we see pyramids, pharaohs, and death-defying architecture. But behind every monument was a desk, and behind every desk, a scribe. The power of the pharaoh may have ruled over gold and stone, but it was the humble scribe who carved their immortality into memory. The lifeblood of an empire. To govern a nation stretched across deserts, the pharaohs needed more than soldiers. They needed information. And information came from the scribes. Each grain shipment, each priest's tithe, each minute of royal ceremony was recorded not for celebration, but for consistency. Papyrus scrolls filled dusty chambers beneath temple square catacombs of inked order. There was no audience for these documents, no applause, just a constant flow of accountability. What today looks like faded script once kept Egypt functioning day by day, line by line. The scribe's sacred education. In the house of Lifa scribe school adjacent to major temples, young boys trained endlessly. Hours of copying proverbs, lists of animals, market inventories. Mistakes were scorned. Style was secondary to legibility. The Book of Kemet, Egypt's scribal guide, didn't encourage expression. It demanded obedience to the line. Students practiced writing words for cattle and grain far more often than God or king, because ultimately, it was livestock and crops, not divine favor, that sustained Egypt. The mathematics of math, the Egyptian concept of cosmic balance, was maintained not through warfare, but math. Scribes calculated irrigation patterns, field taxes, and building angles. The Great Pyramid could only rise because someone, likely nameless, measured and remeasured limestone blocks to the millimeter. That's boring brilliance. Even the Nile flood logs, kept for centuries on temple walls, reflect this quiet precision. Every year, the water level was marked. A high flood meant prosperity. Low flood meant famine. Scribes ensured survival by writing numbers, not prayers. Bureaucracy and salt, a surprisingly contentious topic in ancient Egypt. Salt taxes. In the 5th dynasty, coastal merchants had to pay a fixed salt tribute. Scribes recorded every grain weighed. When discrepancies occurred, it wasn't soldiers who investigated it, or scribal auditors. These dusty confrontations mattered. Salt preserved food, enabled trade, and paid workers. Without scribes, miscounted salt could spark famine. One particularly mundane papyrus from the time of Pharaoh Jedkare contains 42 entries about salt rations. Not thrilling, but vital. Immortality in ink, ironically, while most scribes wrote for fleeting bureaucracy. Their own toolstone and papyrus outlived the empires they served. The instruction of Tehodopi, written around 2400 BC, teaches ethical work habits. Do not speak angrily to the one who copies your words. All men need correction. It's the earliest office manual in history. Thousands of years later, the scribes who quietly balanced Egypt's books still whisper through fragments in museum drawers. Forgotten names but eternal impact. In ancient China, power didn't come from battlefield glory. It came from passing a test. Not just any test, a marathon of memory, morality, and penmanship. Welcome to the world of the Confucian bureaucrat. The imperial examination system. To become a civil servant in imperial China, especially during the Tang and Song dynasties, one had to endure the most grueling academic test humanity had ever devised. 4 days, candidates sat in tiny stalls, scrawling answers to philosophical questions. Their task: interpret Confucian texts, compose policy essays, write poetry. No calculators, no multiple choice, just your brain, brush, and bladder control. Hundreds of thousands of hopefuls prepared for years. Most failed, but those who passed earned a desk. And that desk mattered more than any sword. Morality over machinery. Confucian philosophy shaped the bureaucracy. Officials weren't selected for charisma or cunning, but for moral clarity. The Analects of Confucius guided daily decisions. If someone stole grain, a true Confucian would weigh not just punishment, but ethics. Was the theft due to poverty? Was the law applied fairly? Boring? Maybe. But it fostered one of history's longest-running bureaucracies. Rulers leaned on scholars who quoted sages rather than generals. Wisdom became law. Officials resolved disputes by referencing poems and parables. There was litigation by literature. Ledgers of rice and responsibility. Most civil servants managed the mundane. They tracked rice quotas, checked canal levels, counted families per village. A bureaucrat's day was 90% paperwork, 5% ritual, and maybe 5% actual decision. Still, the records were meticulous. Daily grain reports categorized by harvest zone, tax logs for silk, salt, and tea, weather scrolls charting seasonal wind shifts. These documents weren't thrilling, but they kept China functioning across dynasties. Monotony and mandarins. Once appointed, an official became a mandarin, a symbol of scholarly prestige. Their clothes were fine, their duties decidedly not. They reviewed land disputes, audited rice barns, ensured smooth postal delivery. Every report was every ledger reviewed with slow precision. They worked in silence. Errors weren't tolerated, and yet society trusted these quiet men more than warlords or merchants. A well-run province was one with a steady mandarin who embraced paperwork without flair. The daily grind of glory. An average mandarin's diarrheas. Some were preserved reeds, like this. Inspected canal. Found 2 cracks. Approved request for 5 oxen. Denied request for 9th wife. Copied 20 verses of the Golden Mean. Mistook character, rewrote. Nothing dramatic. Yet through such entries, order held. History doesn't always gallop, it often shuffles quietly in slippers. Castles crumbled. Kings died. Plagues came and went. But the ledger remained. In medieval Europe, survival wasn't won by sword alone, it was calculated by quill. While the common image of the Middle Ages may feature armored knights and burning witches, the true architects of continuity sat bent over parchment, copying, counting, and cataloguing. The bureaucratic spine of Europe was forged in quiet cloisters and dusty manor houses. The Doomsday Book. England's Census of Power in 1086. William the Conqueror commissioned a comprehensive survey of England. Its name, the Doomsday Book, a 413-page document detailing what each landholder possessed. Fields, plows, oxen, peasants. Why? William wanted to tax accurately. He didn't rely on nobles' memory. He relied on scribes. Every village was visited, every barn counted. It was dull, exhaustive, and revolutionary. This boring book unified England under one bureaucratic gazer, feat unmatched for centuries. Monastic scribes, copyists of the sacred and mundane. In the silent scriptoriums of abbeys, monks spent years hand-copying texts. We know them best for reproducing gospels and psalters, but they also preserved property deeds, legal codes, and harvest records. Amongst typical day involved morning prayers, hours of silent transcription, breaks for counting inventory or preparing ink, evening chanting. Their parchment records noted grain silos, rainfall levels, and cheese inventories. These numbers provided economic stability across feudal Europe. If a peasant starved or a lord overtaxed, it was the fault of a miscalculated scroll. Manor rolls and the dull majesty of feudalism in manorial courts. Stewards maintained rolls of tenant rents, obligations, and fines. The court itself was modest. No grand halls, just a table, some candles, and several steely-eyed clerks. Did Gertrude owe 1 chicken, or 2, for her late harvest? Was Elias punished fairly for grazing beyond his strip? How many bushels came from the Westfield? The rolls answered these questions, year after year. They weren't dramatic, but they were the operating manual for rural life. Taxation and the rise of clerks. By the 13th century, royal taxation demanded vast documentation. Clerks rose in status. Not noblemen, but pencil pushers. They worked in chancelleries, sorting land grants, registering deaths, certifying markets. Their names were rarely recorded. Their influence, always present. A single misplaced seal could lead to decades of confusion and costly feuds. Boredom didn't make their work easy, it made it precise. Bureaucracy as power. Medieval Europe's rulers learned that brute force expired but ledgers endured. Kings appointed chancellors to manage correspondence and revenue. Bishops oversaw diocesan archives, filled with marriage logs and birth registry. Merchants hired notaries to record deals and settle disputes peacefully. The paper was often reused. Ink faded, but what it contained: land rights, taxes. Behind every joust or rebellion sat a clerk with an inkwell, making history legible. Venice shimmered in gold, its canals buzzed with gondolas, and merchants whispered deals in dozens of dialects. But beneath the glittering surface, the city thrived because of an army of clerks. Venice didn't rule the seas by strength alone, it ruled with ledgers, logbooks, and lists. This was an empire not of territory, but of paperwork. The arsenal, a shipyard, powered by paper. The Venetian arsenal, founded in the early 1100s, was a marvel not just for shipbuilding, but for bureaucratic precision. Each ship was crafted using modular parts. Every plank, nail, and rope was accounted for. Inventory clerks monitored timber from Dalmatia, iron, imports from Austria, sailcloth spun in Milan. A ship could be built in a day, not because of labor speed, but because of paperwork efficiency. Rows of officers lined the arsenal. Clerks issued requisitions, reviewed deliveries, and inspected work logs. It was an early version of industrial management with quills instead of keyboards. The Book of Navigation. Sailors didn't just carry maps, they were required to submit journey logs and maritime reports. Before every voyage, captains submitted crew names, inventory, manifests, predicted weather conditions, insurance agreements after return. They delivered cargo tallies, port stop confirmations, medical incidents. The Book of Navigation became a sprawling database of the Mediterranean, updated silently by uncelebrated clerks in the Doge's chambers. The Venetian government paid handsomely for facts, not talis. The Council of Ten. Oversight through silence. Venice's ruling elite, particularly the Council of Ten, relied heavily on documented intelligence. Their power stemmed from reading reports, not giving speeches. Anonymous tip-offs were processed, coded, and filed. If someone was caught bribing a customs officer, it was first noticed by an accountant, not a guard. They had their own espionage branch, not spies with daggers, but scribes with access to shipping manifests and court attendance logs. To disappear in Venice meant appearing too often in the wrong ledger. Bureaucracy built wealth. Venice taxed salt, pepper, cargo, volume, ship docking, time guild membership. Each had its own department. Each department used multi-column ledgers for itemizing goods, ink seals for authenticity. Clerks rose through ranks like modern analysts. The dullest jobs, say counting sardines, could lead to monitoring international trade if done flawlessly. In Venice, boredom was a ladder. Archives of empire. By the 1400s, Venice had developed what many call the earliest modern archive. Documents were stored by date, category, and outcome. Librarians maintained these records with religious devotion. Scholars today still study the secret archives of Venice and boxes, untouched for 600 years. They hold marriage licenses, death, tax receipts, transcripts of petty lawsuits, recipes for plague elixirs. The drama is in the details, and Venice never missed one. The Ottoman Empire stretched across 3 continents, commanded armies, minted coinage, and shaped global politics. But none of that mattered if someone failed to log the wheat shipments from Aleppo. In Istanbul's back offices and Anatolia's distant provinces, the real power lay with scribes, surveyors, and accountants who quietly maintained a vast machinery of governance. They were the ledger lords, and they built an empire out of ink and diligence. The Defter system. Mapping a continent, the heart of Ottoman bureaucracy was the Defter. Massive registers that documented land ownership, tax obligations, agriculture, and population data. They were created during Turia, where scribes rode into the provinces with ink pots strapped to saddles, lists of questions about irrigation and livestock orders to interview village leaders. Weigh granaries and measure fields. Each defter was long, sometimes up to 600 pages. Entries included village names, number of married and unmarried men, type and amount of crops, water source and irrigation notes, religious affiliation and tax exemptions. These were spreadsheets on parchment, and they gave Istanbul visibility into distant mountains and coastal markets. Bureaucratic cadence. A life of quiet order. Ledger lords weren't noblemen or warriors. They were men in robes, hunched over paperwork. Their days began with prayer, followed by hours of reviewing petitions from farmers, cross-checking field reports, calculating tax burdens based on weather anomalies. Mistakes weren't tolerated. A misreported harvest could mean famine relief went to the wrong province or was denied altogether. Officials were trained not only in writing, but in Ottoman arithmetic, which included geometry, algebra, and practical surveying methods. Accuracy meant survival. Taxing the rain, yes, rain was taxed. In several regions, water rights were precious. If a village used state-funded canals, their water consumption was monitored, and scribes recorded date of rain collection, barrow capacity, distribution ratio among farms. These numbers were boring, until a drought hit. Then, these ledgers became life. In one case, a mislogged rainfall caused a province-wide audit that took 2 years to resolve. The silent machine of faith. The Ottoman Empire was also deeply religious, and its faith was organized through paperwork. Mosque construction required approval via ledger entries. Friday sermons were logged for content and attendance. Endowments were documented with obsessive precision. Waqf officials tracked exact square footage of donated land. Use case validation. Expected income and maintenance costs. Their records spanned centuries. Some WAQF buildings are still operating today thanks to Defter's written 400 years ago. The lettered pulse of empire. Even the empire's heartbeat. Its postal service was driven by ink. Relay stations documented messenger arrival times, horse condition reports, delays due to snow or bandits. Every letter that crossed the empire left a trail of reports. If a decree from the Sultan reached Damascus late, someone investigated the route and submitted a 3-page summary on parchment. Archives and afterlife. Ottoman archives filled entire buildings. Scribes filed documents by region, subject, and ruling dynasty. Some records were triple coppered, one for local use, one for regional storage, and one sealed for They documented everything. Oil prices in Bursa, birth records in Bosnia, plague incidents in Cairo, repairs of a fountain in Skopje. These weren't tales of conquest, they were notes from normalcy, but they made conquest sustainable. Revolutions don't always begin with speeches or gunfire. Sometimes, they start with a missing ledger entry, or a tax on salt. In this chapter, we uncover the gentle chaos caused by clerical blunders. Not the kind that make headlines, but the kind that quietly unravel empires. The Salt Registry Scandal. France, 1700s. In pre-revolutionary France, salt wasn't just a condiment, it was currency, medicine, and trade stock, and it was taxed ruthlessly through the gabelle system, so convoluted, even tax collectors got confused. One year, a sleepy clerk misfiled exemptions for several border towns. Thousands paid salt taxes they didn't owe quietly, resentfully. The local nobility ignored the protests. After all, who rebels over seasoning? But these towns began to organize, not with weapons, but with paperwork. They formed salt petitions, drafted complaint scrolls, and sent them in waves to Paris. Clerks in the capital were overwhelmed. By the time anyone realized the mistake, dozens of rural municipalities had declared a passive tax strike. It didn't make front-page history, but it planted seeds of distrust that fed the coming revolution. The lead tax incident. British colonies 1767. In an attempt to raise revenue without triggering riots, the British government passed a modest tax on imported lead. The paperwork was rushed. Ports weren't synchronized. No enforcement strategy existed. Result: chaos in the customs houses. Ships paid fees one day, then received refunds the next. Some captains claimed multiple rebates. Colonial merchants began quietly exploiting the inconsistency, creating internal black markets for construction-grade lead. Eventually, Parliament noticed and quietly repealed the tax, but the lessons stuck. Even boring laws, handled poorly, erode trust. Benjamin Franklin later referenced this fiasco in a private letter, calling it a tax that taxed only patience. The Rice Audit Revolt. India, 1803. In the Bengal Presidency under British rule, rice distribution was vital. A series of clerical audits found discrepancies in rice inventories, but, instead of investigating causes, the Crown imposed fines on the audit reports ignored field conditions, relying solely on arithmetic. Villagers resisted not by uprising, but by overwhelming officials with Entire communities sent scrolls explaining crop cycles, grain measurements, and historical context. One region even held a scroll march, a protest where farmers walked to the district office carrying handwritten rebuttals in ceremonial bundles. Bureaucratic defiance became a form of protest. The revolt was never violent, but it shut down rice vines for over a year. When errors rewrite empires, the real power of boring history is its consequence. A single, misprinted tax form, ignored exemption, lost petition can shift public mood, inspire resistance, or disrupt governance. These stories don't make it into heroic textbooks, but they shape legal reforms and public trust more deeply than sword fights ever could. Behind every famous revolution, there are 1,000 unseen paper cuts. Treaties have been signed on warships, whispered in palace halls, and inked after long battles. But in one Swiss town, peace nearly collapsed over a plate of history's finer moments. Often hide in the margins menus, seating arrangements, and culinary expectations. In this chapter, we explore how food, especially cheese, quietly shaped peace talks and international relationships. The Treaty of Lausanne and fondue politics in 1923. Diplomats met in Lausanne, Switzerland to renegotiate borders in the aftermath of the Ottoman Empire's collapse. The setting was neutral, idyllic, and cheese delegations from Turkey, Greece, and various European powers arrived. Each day, lunch was served in a formal hall. On day 3, the Swiss host served fondue with an emmental, a traditional pairing. But the Turkish delegation was unfamiliar with fondue etiquette. A visiting general reportedly double-dipped his bread after losing it in the pot. The Greek representative objected publicly. What followed was described in diplomatic minutes as a culinary misunderstanding, later edited to minor procedural tension. While the incident sounds humorous today, it disrupted negotiations for hours. Mediation included local cheese experts clarifying the appropriate protocol. Eventually, the fondue rules were codified into dining notes. Written officiant future meals were served with individual pots to avoid confusion. The Camembert Clause. France and Canada, 1971. During a trade talk between France and Canada, a clause was introduced that regulated cheese imports. The French insisted that Camembert bearing their appellation must meet traditional aging standards, which included unpasteurized processing. Canada, concerned about public health regulations, hesitated. The tension escalated not over tariffs, but over shelf life and bacteria. Negotiators referred to it as the Camembert Clause, and it delayed an entire economic pact by 14 days. Eventually, the treaty included a special exemption allowing small batches of traditional Camembert to enter Canada under historical culinary privilege. The clause remains in effect and rarely noticed. Rituals of respect in Ottoman-Austrian meetings, records from 1765. Describe an Ottoman delegation meeting with Austrian officials in Belgium. The welcome meal included goat cheese, rosa, local delicacy. The Ottoman vizier declined to eat, not out of offense, but religious dietary caution. This was misinterpreted as a rejection of peace terms. Austrian officials drafted a letter expressing concern over the dismissal of hospitality. 2 days of clarification followed, including reserving the dish, using olive oil and changing the cheese sauce. Once resolved, The treaty progressed, but only after a revised menu was agreed upon and officially notarized. The final documents included an attached dietary guideline, showing that food was as binding as ink. Cheese in the margins of policy diplomatic cookbooks exists, no joke. In British Archive, a 1937 handbook titled Dishes of Dignity listed protocols for cheese presentation by region, guidelines for avoiding fermented conflicts, notes on how cutting cheese incorrectly could signal offense in one British-French engagement. Cheddar served warm was seen as a signal of informal insult. A clerk was quietly reassigned. These stories never made headlines, but in the hush of bureaucracy, every bite mattered. Empires weren't just built on stone and steel, they simmered on stoves and fermented in barrels. And when history needed structure, it called upon standardized recipes. In this chapter, we savor the unsung institutional heroes of history, the committees, scribes, and culinary bureaucrats who codified what entire populations would eat. The London Soup Council 1836. The London Soup Council was a public initiative to standardize soup preparation across charity kitchens and workhouses. Why soup? Because it was economical, nutritious, and scalable. The council debated ideal carotuperatous meat substitutes during shortages, broth, thickness standards. Meetings lasted 8 to 12 hours. Clerks recorded statements like, broth consistency shall not exceed 4 ladle rotations per serving. Every recipe was recorded on parchment, bundled, and circulated among institutions. The council's guidelines were later adapted for soldiers' rations during the Crimean War. A boring bowl of soup saved lives. Japan's pickled archives. Meiji period. As Japan modernized during the Meiji Restoration, it launched a curious bureaucratic project: document every regional method of pickling. Fermentation wasn't just culinary, it was practical. Pickled vegetables preserved nutrients for months, and each prefecture had unique traditions. The government hired scholars to collect recipes of soup, record microbial behavior in various climates, analyze vinegar types, and salt ratios. Reports spanned dozens of volumes, many inscribed in kanji so specific they're now deciphered only by fermentation historians. This archive prevented mold outbreaks and helped unify food production for both urban workers and military recruits. Wartime vinegar and public hygiene. During WWI, vinegar became a strategic resource not just for food, but hygiene. Governments in France and Britain catalogued ideal acidity levels for sanitation, preservation methods for trench pickles, vinegar's use in cleaning wounds and reducing lice. The vinegar distribution logs were boringly precise. Bottle count per battalion, estimated spoilage rate, storage barreled humidity. Mistakes were costly. Rotten vinegar jeopardized sanitation. Victory depended partly on how well soldiers stayed clean, and vinegar made that possible. The Rash Recipe Codex. World War II. In World War II, the UK produced a series of standardized ration cookbooks issued to homes, kitchens, and schools. These weren't culinary masterpieces, they were pragmatic documents explaining how to stretch flour, how to flavor dishes using turnips, how to reuse tea leaves. One official pamphlet, Victory Pie, shall include no meat, but simulate texture through oats and margarine. Clerks printed millions of these, logged distribution, and tracked feedback. Recipes changed quarterly, and adjustments were noted in the Home Cook's Bulletin, a newsletter so dull it became a cherished household item. Bureaucracy of taste flavor is fleeting. Bureaucracy captures it. Empires learnt that food could be a tool of public morale, a medium of cultural unity, a method for stabilizing nutrition in uncertain times. And none of it worked without recipes, written, reviewed, and reinforced by clerks. In dusty archives across the globe, you'll find food documents annotated with pencil margins, ration stamps, and spill stains. They're not glamorous, but they're delicious history. You might think of a cookbook as a collection of recipes, but governments thought of it as a classification system. Across the 20th century, nations realized that organizing information about preparation, nutritional value wasn't just helpful, it was powerful. Metadata gave history its order. The rise of recipe cards. Before digital databases, there were recipe cards, and they were everywhere. Governments, hospitals, and school kitchens used them too. Standardize meal planning, track dietary restrictions, control portion sizes. Each card contained dish, name, ingredient list, instructions, serving yield, caloric value. Libraries even categorized recipes using the Dewey Decimal System. In the 1950s, the USDA created thousands of public recipe cards, organizing them by protein source, cultural origin, and preparation method. These were mailed to homemakers and printed on cereal boxes. Meals in military metadata, military food, wasn't just rationed, it was indexed. The U.S. Army Quartermaster Corps developed a metadata system for meals during World War II. Codename TM-10405, contained over 400 recipes tagged by climate suitability, shelf life, and troop morale, impact. For example, Recipe 143B, chili con carne, Recipe 224Q, fruit stew, tropic friendly, low risk of spoilage. Each entry included procurement notes, how easy it was to source ingredients globally. Some meals were removed not because they tasted bad, but because they couldn't be reliably shipped across battle zones. Food wasn't just nourishment, it was logistics. Metadata for school lunches. In the 1960s, public schools began organizing lunches using nutrition metadata. A school district ledger might include calories per age group, ingredients by allergy profile, cost per meal breakdown, cooking time estimates. School kitchens became quiet data labs, refining meal plans down to meal set 3B, beef, casserole, steamed carrots, white roll. Total cost 48 cents. Total prep time 34 minutes, meets 92% of daily nutrient target. This transformed cafeteria cooking into civic planning. International Flavor Classification. UNESCO once commissioned a flavor archive to preserve traditional cuisine. They logged regional herbs, cooking methods, occasion-based dishes, fermentation types. The result, an international flavor catalog, still referenced by cultural preservationists. It doesn't just list recipes, it preserves the relationship between food, identity, and geography. A metadata tag might read, fermented, sour, autumn festival, Central Asia. It's dry, academic, but essential for cultural memory. When boring meant beautiful, what looks boring, charts, indexes, filing cabinets, is actually poetic. Through metadata, the world's meals became legible. Recipes were more than taste. They became numbers, tags, and structures. And in that organization, history found flavor. History remembers the battles, the speeches, the flags waving high. But after the cannons stopped, silence settled into the sound of rubber stamps. In this chapter, we explore how global conflicts and alliances weren't just shaped by generals and diplomats, but by clerks, typists, and treaty technicians who organized the terms of peace, like shipping invoices, quietly and critically. The surrender template. World War II. When Germany surrendered in May 1945, the Allies used a pre-written document known as the Instrument of Surrender, a template drafted months before victory. It included lines for time and date, checkboxes for military branches, space for interpreter notes, closes for delivery of archive. Each country had its own filing copy. The original was typed and duplicated on carbon paper. Clerks waited behind curtains during the ceremony, ready to collect, register, and dispatch copies. Victory was confirmed by initials on a line and filed by ceasefire filing in Korea. The Korean Armistice Agreement of 1953 was a bureaucratic masterpiece. Negotiators exchanged thousands of pages of troop positions, terrain maps, prisoner lists, and supply logs. Before the handshake, clerks spent weeks organizing chronological drafts of every clause, backup copies with serial numbers, rubber stamps for authentication in 3 languages. The final documents were bound in leather and stored in climate-controlled containers. The ceremony lasted 9 minutes. The paperwork, 9 months. Peace tracking in Geneva. Peace talks in Geneva, especially those involving Vietnam and Cambodia, featured a unique system. Negotiators used color-coded filing folders to symbolize negotiation zones. Green for ceasefire terms, blue for humanitarian corridors, red for territorial boundaries. Assistants became specialists in indexing resolutions and rebuttals with pin-like precision. Daily logs tracked which side requested which wording change. You'll never find these logs in textbooks, but they defined the final language of peace. Without them, the handshake would mean nothing. The postal armistice. Falklands conflict. After the Falklands War in 1982, British and Argentine officials agreed to transfer surrender notes via courier mail, avoiding in-person hostilities. The peace process relied on certified mail stamps, delivery confirmation, logs receipt, registers in diplomatic archive. One document was delayed due to postal routing error, causing a 48-hour delay in ceasefire protocol. The issue was resolved by sending the next file via fax machine, which then required digital backup and physical printouts. Even peace relies on delivery times. Peacekeepers and document dossiers. Today, peacekeeping missions are governed by rules of engagement, documentation, supply chain, spreadsheets, property logs for civilian buildings. Every UN peacekeeper carries ID linked to a database tracking their movement, permissions, and health check. Local archives are established wherever missions deploy, often catalogued by specialists hired just to maintain record integrity. Behind each helmet stands a hard drive. No alarms, no heroics, just someone reading a checklist and catching an error. Sometimes, the most powerful act is logging the obvious. This chapter dives into the humdrum heroism of document checkers, maintenance crews, and unnoticed inspectors whose boring reports steered humanity away from catastrophe. The reactor that didn't melt, Ohio 1980, at the Davis-Besse nuclear power station. A routine inspection form, one of hundreds filed weekly, noted slight discoloration near a pressure release valve. The shift technician added a sleepy comment. Minor flaking observed. Recommend closer assessment if pattern persists. The flaking, as it turned out, was the start of a corrosion crack in the reactor's steel head. 3 days later, engineers traced the issue, took the system offline, and prevented a near meltdown. The inspection report wasn't dramatic. It included no warnings in red ink, but it was filed red and acted appropriately, saving thousands. The memo that averted a missile launch. Soviet Union, 1983. Lieutenant Colonel Petrov was manning a Soviet early warning system when it falsely detected incoming U.S. missiles. Protocol dictated reporting it immediately, but Petrov hesitated, citing anomalies in signal data. His reasoning came not from gut instinct but from his review of a technical memo, filed weeks earlier, detailing flaws in sunlight reflection algorithms. That dull memo gave him the confidence to call it a false alarm. Petrov's decision prevented a potential retaliatory strike. The memo itself, filed in a drawer, unclassified, unread by most. Train logs and timeline saves. Japan, 1995. In the Nagano region, a conductor noticed an irregular vibration in the tracks during a regional cargo run. Rather than assume it was railware, he filed a note in the Daily Train Integrity Journal. Engineers reviewed the log, cross-referenced seismic activity reports, and discovered a slight fault line shift. Repairs were done quietly. Weeks later, a 6.9 magnitude earthquake struck tracks on repaired sections held. The journal entry was 8 words long. It wasn't urgent, but it changed an outcome. Allergy registry saves school children, Sweden. 2007. During a school lunch prep, a cook glanced at an updated ingredient substitution list. It had just arrived from the municipal health office. She noticed that a new shipment of tomato sauce contained a trace of lupin, legume that shares allergenic properties with peanuts. Because she read the report and flagged it, 6 children avoided anaphylactic reactions. The report wasn't laminated. It wasn't distributed widely, but one boring document prevented a medical emergency. Oil rig checklists and quiet precautions. Norway oil rigs operate under strict maintenance protocol, with thousands of logs filed each month. In one case, a junior inspector on the Heimdall platform noticed abnormal torque resistance while tightening a flange bolt. He noted it in the routine tension log, which alerted a supervisor. Further investigation revealed structural fatigue in the support column. Repairs were completed within days, weeks before a storm hit. The tension log has no flashy entries, just numbers and initials, but it quietly held the rig together. When silence speaks louder than sirens, the thread running through these stories is quiet vigilance. A checklist marked with pencil, a tech memo filed in a substitution chart thumbtacked to a wall. They don't make headlines. They rarely earn praise, but they prevent explosions, mistakes, and loss. Boring documents aren't just paperwork. They're safety nets woven with ink and repetition. The punch card doesn't stir emotions. Filing cabinets rarely inspire, but these machines, boring as they seem, ushered in revolutions of order. This chapter explores inventions and inventors whose legacy lies not in glamour, but in quiet mastery, because sometimes the most important changes arrive wrapped in monotony. Herman Hollerith and the Census Engine 189. Hollerith was a statistician frustrated by paperwork. The US Census was taking 8 years to process. He invented a machine that used punch cards to encode data, automating the count. Each card recorded name, age, gender, location. Clerks fed them into tabulating machines. The data was processed in weeks, not years. Hollerith's punch cards launched IBM and sparked the data age, all because someone found counting too slow. The machine itself was dull, gears, rollers, slots, but its impact paved the way for modern computing. Melville Dewey and the Decimal Revolution in the 1870s. Libraries were a mess. No standard for books stacked by whim. Dewey devised a decimal-based system to classify knowledge. 100s for philosophy, 500s for science, 800s for literature. Each book got a number. Each number meant a shelf. Each shelf meant order. People called it mechanical, bureaucratic, lifeless. But suddenly, libraries became navigable. Dewey's system was adopted worldwide not because it was beautiful, but because it worked. Grace Hopper and the Language of Logic. In the 1950s, Hopper was a mathematician working on early computers. She believed machines could understand words, not just numbers. She helped invent COBOL, a programming language built for readability and routine business tasks. COBOL was never flashy. It was made for payroll, inventory systems, bank ledgers. Tens of trillions of dollars have passed through COBOL systems and they still hum today. Hopper championed clarity over cleverness. Her brilliance lay in making boring tasks efficient. Otlet and the world's first paper Google. Paul Otlet, a Belgian visionary, dreamed of organizing all human knowledge in index cards. In the early 1900s, he developed a room filled with topic cards, bibliographic entries, knowledge maps. If you wanted to know about beekeeping in Peru, you'd submit a query. Clerks would dig through drawers and reply with written summaries. It was slow, paper-based, and quietly revolutionary. Otlet believed that organization was a moral duty. His work laid conceptual foundations for the internet without ever seeing a screen. Barcode logic and retail rhythms. In the 1970s, inventors George Laurer and Norman Woodland refined the barcode. It was a series of lines, numbers, and silence, but behind it was real-time inventory, tracking price, standardization, retail automation. Barcodes don't talk. They don't inspire, but they hold up entire economies. Every time you scan a box of cereal, you're honoring a machine of dull genius. When boredom innovates, none of these systems sparkle. They're grids, codes, gears, and cards. But they do what history needs most. They bring order to chaos. Hollerith gave us data, Dewey gave us structure, Hopper gave us language, Otlet gave us access, barcodes gave us flow. Their work wasn't loud, it was methodical. But because of them, the modern world ticks. Genius isn't always loud, it often whispers in decimal points and tabulating machines. History is filled with swords and speeches. But what about staplers and folders? The quiet click of a paperclip may not echo in monuments, but it echoes in every decision ever filed. This chapter celebrates the mundane tools that turned bureaucracy into a force strong enough to run kingdoms, corporations, and revolutions one sheet of paper at a time. The paperclip that prevented chaos. Invented in the 1890s, the modern paperclip was immediately embraced by clerks and bureaucrats. Before then, documents were bound by string pinned, with needle-like fasteners stacked loosely, and frequently lost. The paperclip allowed fast attachment, easy rearrangement, and non-damaging organization. In early 20th century government offices, paperclip production and distribution were tracked as a supply priority in par with ink and carbon paper. One Norwegian resistance group even used paperclips as a symbol of unity, quiet, useful, and unbreakable. Rubber stamps. Instant authority. Rubber stamps emerged in the 1800s as a way to certify documents quickly. They were vital across customs offices, courthouses, military passes. Each stamp held power. Without one, a document meant nothing. Approved, denied, received on. These markings governed trade, travel, and trials. Stamp ink was monitored for consistency. Improper stamping led to misfiled cases, delays in pay, and even arrests. Bureaucrats wielded rubber as decisively as monarchs wielded decree. The binder and the filing cabinet empire. The invention of the ring binder in the late 1800s changed how information was stored. Before binders, clerks had to manually sew or stitch documents together. It was time-consuming and inflexible. Binders enabled yearly updates, sectional categorization, quick addition, Removal of pages by the mid-1900s. Entire ministries had offices dedicated to binder upkeep. Index tabs became standardized. The filing cabinet followed, offering vertical repositories of decisions, transactions, and history. A war could end in a handshake, but only if the ceasefire binder was correctly sorted and signed. Pencils, ink pads, and the human touch pencils were prized for erasure. In the margins of draft policies, clerks scribbled, "Query this clause, grammar correction. Please verify recipient." These notes weren't official, but they steered legislation. Ink pads, meanwhile, had to be refreshed constantly. In fading ink, authority could evaporate. Records became void if unreadable. Bureaucratic tools were only as powerful as their maintenance. Office supplies as symbols. Revolutions embraced office supplies. The Soviet Union's official wax seal mold was a prized object. African liberation movements used typewriter ribbons to smuggle coded documents. The stapler became a metaphor in Cold War fiction for pinning down the truth. They're not glamorous, but they held systems together. Without these tools, pages would float. And floating pages don't build nations. The sword may win the day, but it's the pen that decides what happens tomorrow. From royal signatures to bureaucratic loops, the pen has etched power across parchment, policy, and pages of command. It may seem modest, but its legacy is monumental. Signatures that shifted borders throughout history, pens carried authority far beyond their form. Consider the Treaty of Tordesillas, where Portugal and Spain divided the unknown world with a stroke of ink. The Act of Union between England and Scotland, sealed not with fanfare, but with a flourish of quills on vellum. The Sykes-Picot Agreement, a map chopped up by pens, redrawing the future of the Middle East. The act of signing became a ceremonial pivot. Pens were carved, dipped in ink, then preserved as historical relics. One pen changed borders. A second version was placed in a museum. Bureaucratic looping. The art of legal writing. Government pens didn't just sign. They looped and laced words, crafting legislation, court orders, and policy memos. Clerks were trained in penmanship styles. Cursive for ceremonial documents, copperplate for land deeds. Italic block for military dispatches. Style mattered. Sloppy handwriting could invalidate laws. In fact, the U.S. Declaration of Independence was penned with extreme clarity. Writing wasn't about flair, it was about trust. Pens in education and social engineering. In 20th century schools, pens shaped behavior. Blue ink was for corrections. Black ink for final exams. Red ink for discipline reports. The pen's color communicated power dynamics. Teachers kept ink logbook, sporing registries that tracked performance, discipline, and parental contact. These logs were later studied by sociologists, revealing trends in early childhood bias, socioeconomic disparity, and institutional rigidity. A child's future often flowed from a teacher's nib. Diplomatic pens. Choosing the right ink when treaties are signed today. Officials often debate the pen itself, ballpoint or fountain, personal signature pen or ceremonial, black or blue. At one UN signing, the president of a delegation refused to use an unfamiliar pen. Negotiators paused to find an ink he trusted. The moment wasn't recorded on official TV, but it lives in the footnotes of a clerk's event summary. The collector's archive pen. Collectors often hold historical pens. Kennedy's signing pen from the Nuclear Test Ban Treaty. Churchill's cigar-stained fountain pen. Gandhi's simple ink holder, used for prison correspondence. These items aren't powerful because of their material. They matter because of what they witnessed. Each pen has quietly transferred intent, law, and emotion, one signature at a time. Epilogues written in ink, even today. Legal documents require pen signatures. Digital approvals may exist, but a real-world signature is still proof of consent, a trigger for execution, a signal of legitimacy. Hospitals keep pens chained to clipboards. Courts preserve signatures with time. In the age of screens, the pen remains policy's final form. It may be boring, but boring is binding. Time isn't just measured, it's enforced. Behind every deadline, appointment, harvest, and tax cycle, there's a calendar quietly commanding order. In this chapter, we trace the historical rise of bureaucratic timekeeping, from crop schedules to corporate quarterlies, and how civilization built obedience one date at a time. Ancient agricultural calendars. The Egyptians had one of the earliest bureaucratic calendars. Rather than focus on celestial beauty, they used their 365-day grid to schedule Nile irrigation, collect grain taxes, time festivals, to ensure farming breaks every major decision planting. Building Sakrisan was mapped to a date. Government scribes created crop calendars handed to village officials, who then adjusted local duties based on seasonal phases. The moon didn't dictate, traditionalized quotas did. Roman bureaucracy and leap logic. The Julian calendar, introduced by Julius Caesar in 45 BC, wasn't just about censing the sun, it was about regulating civic life. The Roman bureaucratic year structured Senate sessions, tax collection dates, soldier enrollment cycles. It even created loopholes. Some officials would delay decisions by claiming the date wasn't EOS. Later refinements added the leap year not for cosmic elegance, but to fix errors in property and census paperwork. Islamic calendars and record cycles. In Islamic governance, timekeeping intertwined deeply with religious and civic rhythms. The Hijri calendar lunar system structured Zakat deadlines, Ramadan food audits, Hajj quota assignments. Ottoman scribes created elaborate scheduling charts to align lunar rituals with secular governance. Sometimes, lunar drift caused overlaps between fasting and planting seasons, requiring revised agricultural logs and harvest extensions. Time was a negotiation between heavens and bureaucracy. Medieval time taxes in some European kingdoms. Calendar control meant wealth. Officials taxed events by month. Spring marriages were cheaper, winter funerals incurred surcharge. Harvest festivals required payment to hold land. Celebrations, town halls had time registrars. Their job was to verify that you paid to use a calendar day for your event. These records, scribbled into marginal ledgers, often decided estate legitimacy and family lineage. Without them, time had no legal meaning. Industrial age and punch cards. The factory revolution didn't just clock workers, it regimented entire cities. Factories issued clock-in punch cards, shift calendars, payment schedules tied to week lengths. Missing a punch wasn't just inconvenient, it created pay errors, insurance gaps, and union grievances. Managers filed entire binders devoted to attendance accuracy. In one case, a British mine collapsed due to overstaffing on a day misprinted on the shift calendar. The incident spurred regulations that required backup date logs in all high-risk industries. The calendar audit. Corporate discipline. Modern corporations audit their calendars with surgical precision. Executives track budget quarters, product launch, Windows performance, review cycles, tax deadlines. A mistimed email can derail fiscal filings. A missing timestamp invalidates legal contracts. Internal departments maintain calendar control centers, digital or paper, that sync operations globally. Your deadline didn't come from urgency. It came from a bureaucrat watching the calendar tick. When time became policy, calendars have done more than organize events. They've enforced order, legalized existence, and punished deviation. The calendar determines when you can marry, when your taxes are due, when your passport expires, when your report is late. It's not just a tool, it's a governance interface disguised as stationery. Time may feel fluid, but bureaucracy makes it solid, line by line, date by date. They didn't make speeches, they didn't start wars, but they made sense of it all. Clerks are the ghostwriters of civilization. For every crowned ruler, every policy, every law, there was a clerk who copied, sorted, catalogued, and made it legible. And though most were never named, their systems endured. The copyists of the colonial courts. In the British colonies, courtrooms weren't known for drama, they were known for documentation. Court clerks recorded proceedings by hand, tracked fines and fees, transcribed depositions, often verbatim indexed rulings for future reference in one court in Calcutta. A clerk spent 41 years organizing a case ledger. His name appears once on a dusty thank you certificate, yet his records helped British and Indian law interact for decades. When cases crossed continents, his filing system kept justice synchronized. Typists behind policy in the 20th century. Before digital databases, typists transformed handwritten notes into official documents. Government memos, education reforms, even war briefings all passed through their fingertips. Their roles involved deciphering hurried handwriting, formatting for clarity, catching unintentional errors, filing duplicates into master folders. One World War II-era typist in Washington, D.C. spotted a contradiction in troop allocation orders simply by retyping overlapping pages. Her correction rerouted supply chains. Her name was never publicized. She didn't command battalions. She typed them into efficiency. Librarians as data architects before metadata and search engines. Librarians were the search engines. Through card catalogs, index nodes, and classification codes, they built knowledge systems, academic pathways, intellectual accessibility. Every library in the mid-1900s had at least one librarian who knew how to retrieve a book that had been seen in 40 years just by intuition and filing memory. Their minds were GPS for knowledge. Their work created information's infrastructure. Census takers walked door to door asking ordinary questions that become extraordinary data. They log names, ages, and income brackets, correct spelling inconsistencies, sync forms across counties, flag statistical anomalies. 1. U.S. Enumerator in 1960 flagged a trend in urban migration that later shaped housing policy nationwide. She wasn't a sociologist, just a careful observer with a clipboard. Her observations lived on in zoning reforms and infrastructure funding. Archivists and the Code of Preservation. Archivists don't just store history, they decide what survives. They restore brittle documents, judge which files deserve permanent storage, write finding aids and summaries, digitize information quietly. An archivist in Prague spent 35 years recovering lost correspondence from a 19th century medical college. Her work helped historians rediscover forgotten cures, social movements, and global networks of care. Her name never made it into the textbook, but her rescued papers did. The quiet culture of structure. These figures worked in silence, sometimes lifetimes. But without them, courts couldn't remember precedents, schools couldn't build curricula, governments couldn't legislate, journalists couldn't quote history, systems endure because caretakers exist. Even today, an unnamed data cleaner might be shaping tomorrow's medical breakthrough simply by flagging a typo. Forgetting their names doesn't erase their impact. It reinforces how quietly powerful structure really is. No crown, no constitution, just an org chart and a deadline. In the modern era, bureaucracy reinvented itself in boardrooms and took the world with it. From startups to multinational giants, the mechanisms of control, order, and dull but vital documentation evolved into an entire culture known simply as the office. This chapter tracks how corporations became empires of policy, powered by human resource forms and compliance software. From ministries to managers, when companies began growing beyond family businesses, they needed systems, borrowing from government archives and military manuals. Early corporations adopted personnel files, modeled on military service records, annual budgets, tracked like tax ledgers, meeting minutes resembling parliamentary records. By the 1950s, corporate managers mimicked ministry structures, department heads as decision makers, middle managers as clerks, HR teams as behavior. The language shifted, but the function was familiar. Command through formality. The rise of the employee handbook. The corporate equivalent of a civic constitution is the employee handbook. These documents outline workplace etiquette, code of conduct, reporting procedures, benefits and retirement structure. Early handbooks were simple. Modern ones spanned hundreds of pages, with clauses governing social media, grievance reporting, and remote work logistics. If the company was a country, the handbook was its law book. Employees are onboarded through a ritual of forms, trainings, document acknowledgements, much like conscription into imperial service, but with ergonomic chair tutorials, quarterly reports. The corporate calendar, just like ancient tax cycles and court seasons. Corporations enforce time through quarterly reports. These documents dictate earnings projections, departmental performance, budget adjustments, investor relations, strategies. Failure to meet a quarterly goal can trigger reorganization, hiring freezes, CEO apologies, and dull press releases. The quarter isn't just time, it's power. And spreadsheets are its scepter. Compliance. The modern audit, army government audits, used to track grain and livestock. Corporate audits now track digital security, diversity metrics, workplace safety, procedures. Entire teams exist to review email logs, document training completion, certify internal behavior against federal standards. Compliance officers. One missed checkbox can lead to fines, lawsuits, or worse, bad press. Modern emperors fear regulation more than rebellion. Workflow software as bureaucratic engine tools like Microsoft SharePoint, Jira, Asana, Confluence serve as digital filing cabinets for project milestones, bug reports, leave requests. Archives. The user interfaces are streamlined, but behind every click is a chain of review, approval, and timestamped logging. Bureaucracy didn't die, it was uploaded. Email chains and decision trails. Office workers send 100 plus emails a day. Hidden in inboxes are performance decisions, budget allocations, hiring approvals, strategy pivots, archived by IT. Subpoenaed in lawsuits, these emails are the modern equivalent of stamped parchment. A hastily typed yes can become a legally binding signal. A polite note it can indicate policy change. The cathedral of corporate bureaucracy. There's beauty in the bland. An access badge granting entrance to status. An onboarding video that replaces initiation writes a form that structures a grievance into a claim. Corporate bureaucracy doesn't inspire revolution, but it holds up empires worth billions. And just like medieval scribes, today's admins, coordinators, and systems analysts are its quiet architects. Civilization doesn't rise in shouts. It unfolds in whispers. Behind every revolution is a checklist. Behind every movement is a memo. This story began in clay tablets and wins its way through digital dashboards. We've seen empires, corporations, treaties, soup councils, cheese, misunderstandings, and pickled archives all stitched together by repetition, patience, and protocol. This chapter isn't about new information. It's about seeing everything you already know differently. Structure versus spectacle. We often celebrate spectacle, crowns, cannons, protests, breakthroughs, but structure, bureaucracy, planning, filing, again is what makes the spectacle stick. The Great Wall had stone, yeah, but it had ledgers tracking brick deliveries. The Civil Rights Act was powerful but required careful typing, distribution, and reading by thousands of clerks. Your local library doesn't run on magic. It runs on cataloging software and cleaning schedules. Order isn't exciting, but it's what lets excitement survive. Boring is beautiful. There's a strange grace in consistent formatting, archived timelines, marginal notes, correcting typos in history. That beauty isn't flamboyant. It's reliable, like rainfall schedules or shift rotations that ensure someone's always on duty. In boredom, we find continuity. In silence, we find coordination. Boring doesn't mean lifeless, it means alive through routine. The intelligence of monotony behind every headline. Someone filed the report, verified the data, rewrote the paragraph 3 times, attached the right approval sticker. That's not passive, it's participatory. The pulse of civilization runs through small tasks, done well. Boring history isn't dull. It's concentrated, intelligent, squarely administered. Your quiet legacy, you, right now, are part of boring history. Filling out tax forms, saving phone bills, signing a rental lease, logging into a work dashboard. Decades from now, someone might study your life through those exact records. They won't read your tweets. They'll read your energy bills. Not your bio, but your prescription history. Not your memories, but your metadata. In what's ordinary, you become immortal. A whisper worth hearing, the loudest stories fade fast, but the ones filed, sorted, logged, and quietly preserved, those last. Civilization isn't an opera, it's a spreadsheet, and boring history isn't a side note. It's the main story. Every quiet page we've read together was part of how the world doesn't fall apart.